One of my favorite landscape plants for shady and semi-shady locations is the caladium. It adds really a lot of color in these areas that sometimes are difficult places to find a suitable plant for. The caladium comes, of course, in a variety of colors of whites, pinks, and reds, and some shades in between. It's a little bit early to plant caladiums in the garden right now, but we need to be thinking about it. For example, you will be able later on to choose a caladium in a 5 or 6 inch pot such as this, and put these in after all danger of frost is past and the soil has warmed up. But when you buy a caladium like this in a pot, you're probably going to pay anywhere from $4.50 to $6 for that plant, depending upon where you get it. So you may want to get a head start on that and save a little bit of money and actually have a little bit of an experience in growing your own caladiums, because you can also buy now at most nurseries and garden centers and many of the mass plant outlets caladium tubers. Now, the caladium tuber is sort of an ugly-looking little character right now, but he grows into a really beautiful plant. These caladium tubers are going to cost you anywhere from 50 cents to maybe 90 cents, depending again upon where you get them. But again, keep in mind, it's still too early to go out in the ground or the soil with these tubers at this time. The rule of thumb on planting tubers out of doors for caladiums is when the soil is temperature has risen to about 60 to 65 degrees. One way to tell that is to observe the Bermuda grass. And if the Bermuda grass is greened up, you have a nice green growing circumstance on your Bermuda grass, probably that soil has warmed up to where you can go into the garden with the caladiums. But what I like to do is get these started early in pots, because you can go ahead and pot these up, keep them in a cold frame or a hotbed or a little greenhouse if you've got one, or a sunroom, and get a real early start on these now by giving them 3 or 4 weeks in advance. Caladiums really do not need to be planted very deep in the pots. I like to put them in a good potting soil. Just lay them on top of the potting soil and cover them only about 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep, and then water them well, set them in a warm location, and you'll find that before too long, growth will really start quickly on these caladiums, and you'll be ready to go in the garden with them. But let me give you another tip on these. The caladium has several growing points, and if we're wanting a caladium plant that has a lot of shoots and growing points like we have in the pots, then you want to be sure and choose those tubers so that they're going to give you this. You may look at the tubers and kind of paw through them in the bin, and if you were to pick one out like this where there's really one main growing tip, you may have a few other tips here, but they're not really going to sprout up very much. So what you want to do is choose a large tuber, one that has a lot of knots and bumps on it, because each one of these is a growing tip. But there's still another point that you may want to keep in mind. When planting these caladium tubers in your pots and getting them started, one thing you can do is to break that little tip out if it's begun to grow like this already, and then simply invert it in the pot. And what you have done then has destroyed the apical dominance or the growing tip of that caladium tuber. This is going to cause a lot of latent buds to be forced out, and so you'll get a caladium plant growing with many, many more shoots than you would if you just planted these upright, or than if you just planted them in their normal fashion. They're going to be a little bit slower in coming this way, but your reward will pay off in the long run because you have a much fuller, bushier plant to put into the garden. So I would suggest that if you like caladiums in your landscape in shady and semi-shady locations, then think about getting you some tubers now and getting those started early so you'll have some plants to go in the garden, save yourself a little bit of money, and have some fun in growing your own.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.